I grew up in a house that looked like something out of a home and garden magazine. White pillars framed the front porch, our lawn was trimmed to perfection, and my mother made sure the flower beds bloomed in perfect harmony. My father, a meticulous man with a taste for classic architecture, often boasted that our house was the pride of the neighborhood. Inside, everything had its place. The polished wooden floors reflected the soft glow of chandeliers, and the scent of fresh linen always lingered in the air. My mother took pride in order, in appearance, in maintaining an image of elegance. It was the kind of house where laughter never echoed too loudly, where voices never rose above a polite hum. At the center of it all was me, Elena Harding, the only child, the apple of my parents' eye. Or at least, that's what I thought back then. My mother would dress me in fine clothes, press my hair into neat waves, and beam whenever a neighbor complimented my manners. My father, though reserved, made sure I had the best, private tutors, piano lessons, ballet. I was their little star, and I basked in their approval. Our dinners were grand affairs. My father at the head of the table, my mother arranging the silverware with military precision, and me sitting between them, listening to their conversations about work, society, and all the ways our family was destined for greatness. We weren't wealthy by any stretch, but my parents worked hard to maintain the illusion of it. Reputation mattered more than reality. And in that perfect, glimmering house, I felt safe. I believed that love was woven into every pressed tablecloth, every carefully arranged bookshelf. That was before I learned how fragile that love truly was. Some of my earliest memories are filled with the scent of my mother's perfume, light, floral, lingering in every room she walked through. She had a way of moving through the house like she was gliding, always in control, always composed. My father, on the other hand, was a man of quiet authority. His voice never needed to rise for people to listen. When he spoke, his words were deliberate, measured. I loved them. I really did. Our family had routines that made everything feel secure, predictable. Sunday mornings were for brunch at the country club, my mother insisting I wear a dress with matching shoes. She liked to show me off. Such a well-mannered child, people would say. I'd smile, knowing how pleased she was when I heard it. On weekday evenings, my father would come home, loosen his tie, and sit in his favorite chair with a glass of whiskey. I would tell him about my day, about school, my teachers, my grades. He would nod, approving but distant, always reminding me that excellence was expected, not rewarded. Good, he would say if I got the highest score on a test. As it should be. I never questioned it. I never had a reason to. Birthdays were elegant, but never overindulgent. Christmases were pristine, with presents wrapped in gold and silver paper, arranged just so under the tree. I never wanted for anything, and yet my parents never spoiled me. They gave me just enough to keep me grateful, to remind me that all of this, the life we lived, was something to be earned. And I was happy to earn it. Looking back, I can see how much I loved their approval, how much I needed it. It was woven into my very being, the certainty that if I worked hard, if I behaved, if I was perfect, they would always love me just the same. I had no idea how quickly that love could shift, how easily it could be given to someone else. By the time I was 10, I had mastered the art of being the perfect daughter. I excelled in school, never spoke out of turn, and always made sure to be exactly what my parents expected. My mother would beam with pride when I received compliments from family friends. My father would pat my shoulder and say, "That's my girl." Our home remained a place of order, of routine, of carefully curated perfection. My parents had high standards, but I met them. I had too. As I got older, my world expanded beyond our pristine house and carefully planned outings. I had friends at school, teachers who encouraged me, and hobbies I enjoyed: reading, painting, even daydreaming about the future. But no matter how much I grew, my place in the family remained unchanged. I was Elena Harding, the first and only child, the pride of my parents. I never thought anything could disrupt that. That year, my mother and father started hosting more dinner parties, entertaining friends and acquaintances in our grand dining room. I'd sit quietly at the table, listening as they talked about business, politics, and the future. My mother would glance at me now and then, offering a small, approving nod when I remained composed and polite. Everything was exactly as it had always been. I remember one evening in particular. The house was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the scent of rosemary and roasted lamb lingering in the air. My mother had styled my hair in soft curls, my father had introduced me to some of his colleagues, and for a moment, I felt untouchable. Safe. And then, as my mother refilled a guest's glass, she laughed, a soft, secretive kind of laugh, and said something that made my stomach twist. "We're considering expanding our family." I turned to look at her, confused. I hadn't heard anything about this before. My father merely chuckled, offering her an indulgent smile. "Nothing's set in stone," he said smoothly. "But we'll see what the future holds." I felt something cold creep into my chest. I didn't understand why, but in that moment, I had the strangest feeling that something was about to change. Something irreversible. I remember the day my mother told me she was pregnant. She sat me down in the living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a warm, expectant smile on her face. My father stood nearby, watching me carefully, as if gauging my reaction. "Elena, sweetheart," my mother began, her voice soft. "You're going to be a big sister." The words didn't register at first. I just stared at her, waiting for the moment when she'd laugh and say she was joking. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "Isn't that wonderful?" she asked. I nodded because that was the correct response. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "That's great news." But something inside me felt wrong. At first, nothing really changed. My mother was still her usual self, elegant and composed, though she became softer around the edges, more delicate in her movements. My father was just as distant as always, but now he spoke about preparing for the baby and making space in our lives. I tried to push down the unease that crept into my thoughts, tried to be happy, to embrace the idea of a little sibling. It was what my parents expected. Then, Sophia was born. The day they brought her home, the house transformed into something unrecognizable. My mother, usually poised and controlled, became entirely consumed by the tiny bundle in her arms. My father, who had never been the doting type, suddenly softened in ways I'd never seen before. I hovered in the doorway of Sophia's nursery, watching my mother rock her gently, whispering lullabies I had never heard before. My father stood beside her, his fingers brushing the baby's tiny hands, his eyes filled with something I had never seen directed at me. Pure, unfiltered adoration. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Of course, they were excited. This was their new baby, their new daughter. It made sense that they'd be focused on her. But then the shift became undeniable. Dinners that were once strict and formal became chaotic, with my mother excusing herself constantly to tend to Sophia. My father, who once asked about my grades every evening, now barely glanced at me as he cradled the baby in his arms. If I spoke, they barely listened. If I asked for something, they were too busy. I had become background noise in my own home. And for the first time in my life, I realized something horrifying. I was no longer the daughter who mattered. At first, I thought it was temporary. Surely, once the excitement of having a newborn faded, things would go back to the way they were. My mother would smile at me like she used to, my father would pat my shoulder with quiet approval, and our house would return to its orderly, predictable routine. But it didn't. Sophia became the center of everything. My mother, once so focused on my appearance, my manners, my achievements, now only cared about whether Sophia had slept, eaten, or smiled that day. My father, who had always been emotionally distant but firm, became someone I barely recognized, soft, warm, present. For her, I waited for them to notice me again. When I came home with a perfect test score, my mother barely looked up from rocking Sophia. "That's nice, sweetheart," she said, her voice distant. "Can you lower your voice? The baby's sleeping." When I won a school competition and rushed to tell my father, he barely acknowledged it. "Good job, Elena," he said absently, bouncing Sophia in his arms. "You've always done well in school. Always done well." As if my success was expected, not celebrated. I started to feel like a guest in my own home. Every room was filled with traces of her, tiny clothes hanging on drying racks, toys scattered across the floor, framed photos of her dotting the shelves. I searched for my own face in those frames, the pictures of me as a child, but slowly, they were replaced. The worst part wasn't just being ignored. It was knowing that my parents weren't even aware of what they were doing. When I spoke, my voice was an afterthought. When I entered a room, I wasn't greeted. At dinner, I was no longer seated in my usual spot next to my mother. That was Sophia's place now, perched in her high chair, my mother fussing over her while I picked at my food in silence. Once, I asked my mother if we could go shopping together like we used to. "I don't have time, Elena," she said, not even looking at me. "Can't you see I have my hands full?" I did see. I saw everything. I saw the way my mother held Sophia as if she were the most precious thing in the world, the way my father's expression softened when he looked at her. I saw how they had given me a place in their lives only until something better came along. And I saw the truth. The moment Sophia was born, I had become invisible. By the time I left for university, I had stopped trying. I stopped waiting for my parents to notice me, stopped chasing their approval, stopped expecting them to care. I told myself it was fine. I focused on my studies, on building a future where I wouldn't have to live in the shadow of my sister. And then, after years of hard work, I reached the day I had been waiting for, my university graduation. It was supposed to be one of the most important days of my life. I had earned this moment. I had spent sleepless nights studying, working part-time jobs to support myself, doing everything I could to build the kind of life I thought my parents would be proud of. So, of course, I invited them. Weeks before the ceremony, I told them the date, the time, everything they needed to know. My mother had nodded, barely listening. My father had said, "We'll see what we can do." I should have known better. The night before my graduation, I called them to confirm. My mother answered, sounding rushed. "Elena, now isn't a good time," she said. I could hear Sophia's voice in the background, whining about something. "I just wanted to make sure you're coming tomorrow," I said, gripping the phone tighter. "The ceremony starts at—" "Oh, sweetheart," she interrupted with a sigh. "We won't be able to make it." I thought I misheard. "What?" "Your sister wants to go to that new cafe downtown," my mother said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "She's been looking forward to it all week, and, well, you know how she gets when she doesn't get what she wants." I couldn't breathe. "You're not coming because of a cafe?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena, don't be dramatic," she said with a slight laugh. "It's just a graduation. You've always been good at school, so this isn't exactly a surprise." But Sophia really wanted to spend the day with us, and I hung up. I stood there, my phone still clutched in my hand, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just that they weren't coming. It wasn't just that they chose her over me, again. It was the ease with which they did it. The casual way my mother dismissed one of the biggest achievements of my life as if it were nothing. That was the moment something inside me broke. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, believing that if I worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, they would finally see me. But they never would. And for the first time, I felt something colder than sadness, heavier than disappointment. I felt rage. I didn't go to the graduation dinner my friends had planned. I didn't go to the after party, didn't celebrate the way I should have. Instead, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at my diploma with a hollow feeling in my chest. I should have felt proud. I had done everything right. I had worked for this moment, suffered through years of exhaustion, sacrifice, sleep, social events, and vacations just to get here. And yet, the only thing I felt was anger. I thought about my parents, sitting in some overpriced cafe with Sophia, laughing with her, treating her like she was the most important person in the world. I thought about how easy it had been for them to forget about me, to brush off my success as if it were nothing. That night, I didn't cry. I planned. For years, I had accepted being treated like an afterthought. I had swallowed every disappointment, every rejection, every time they had chosen her over me. But this time, I wouldn't let it go. This time, they were going to feel what it was like to be discarded. I started small. I distanced myself. When my mother called, I let it go to voicemail. When my father sent a half-hearted, "Hope your graduation went well," text 3 days late, I didn't respond. And when Sophia sent me a picture of her dessert from the cafe they had skipped my graduation for, I deleted the message without opening it. They didn't notice at first. They were too wrapped up in their perfect little family to realize that I was slipping away. But I had a plan, and I was patient. I knew exactly how I was going to hurt them. I was going to take what they valued most. Their comfort, their stability, their security. Everything they had denied me, I was going to take from them. And when I was done, they would know what it felt like to be left behind. I knew my parents would never change. That much had been obvious for years. But what I had never let myself consider, what I had always buried beneath excuses and hope, was that they had never cared in the first place. Not really. If they had, they wouldn't have so easily cast me aside the moment Sophia was born. They wouldn't have ignored my achievements, my struggles, my existence. They wouldn't have forgotten me. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. It started with the car. Technically, it was still in my father's name, but I was the only one who ever drove it. I had paid for its repairs, its gas, its upkeep. It was mine in every way that mattered. And yet, when my father handed me the keys years ago, he had said, "Just remember, Elena, this is a family car." A family car. As if it was theirs to reclaim at any moment. As if it had never really belonged to me. I decided I was going to take it. Not just drive it. Take it. I waited until late at night, until I knew they would be asleep. My parents had always been deep sleepers, and Sophia, despite the way they doted on her, had always been a restless one. That worked to my advantage. I knew they'd be exhausted, worn down from tending to their perfect child. I parked a few blocks away, walking the rest of the distance to avoid suspicion. The house, my childhood home, looked just as perfect as ever, the porch light casting soft shadows against the carefully maintained flower beds. I felt nothing when I saw it. The spare key was exactly where I remembered it, tucked inside the drawer in the entryway. They had never changed the hiding spot, had never even considered the possibility that I might one day use it against them. I moved through the house like a ghost, silent, unseen. My parents' wallets were on the kitchen counter, my father's leather one, my mother's sleek designer clutch. I took them both. Not everything, just enough. A few hundred from each, enough that they wouldn't notice right away, but enough that I could leave without worrying about money for a while. The car was parked in its usual spot in the driveway, gleaming under the moonlight. As I slipped inside and started the engine, a strange feeling settled over me. Not guilt, not fear. Relief. A slow, steady exhale that I hadn't even realized I had been holding in for years. The house, the town, everything that had kept me trapped in the role of the forgotten daughter was finally behind me. I didn't look back as I drove away. For the first time in my life, I was free. I kept driving until I was sure I was far enough away that they couldn't catch up. I had no clear destination in mind, just away. Away from the house that had suffocated me, away from the parents who had abandoned me long before I ever walked out that door. The road stretched endlessly before me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had control over where I was going. My phone started buzzing sometime around dawn. At first, I ignored it. I knew exactly who it would be. By the 10th missed call, I pulled over at a rest stop and checked the screen. Mom. Dad. Over and over. The voicemails started coming next. Elena, call us back right now. My father's voice, stern but controlled, as if he still believed he could order me around. Elena, sweetheart, we just need to talk. My mother, her tone softer, but no less manipulative. Then, a different voice. Elena, where are you? Sophia's voice was laced with confusion, frustration. Mom and Dad are freaking out. Just answer them already. I stared at the screen, at their names lighting up again, and realized something. This was the most attention they had given me in years. Not when I excelled in school. Not when I graduated. Not when I had been begging for even the smallest scrap of affection. No, now that I was gone, Now that I had taken something they valued, suddenly I mattered again. It was almost funny. I turned off my phone. I could imagine them back at the house, my mother pacing the kitchen, wringing her hands, my father calling the police, insisting that the car had been stolen. Maybe they'd start to wonder why I had done it. Maybe, for the first time, they'd have to sit with the uncomfortable realization that they had driven me to this. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a response. I wasn't going to let them pull me back in with apologies they didn't mean or guilt they didn't deserve to lay on me. For once, they could sit in the silence they had left me in for years. And for once, I would be the one who chose to ignore them. I kept driving until exhaustion forced me to stop. By then, I had put almost 300 miles between myself and my parents. I pulled into a cheap motel, paid in cash, and collapsed onto the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about how to please them. I wasn't wondering if they would approve of my choices, if they would acknowledge me, if I was somehow failing them without realizing it. That weight, the constant, crushing weight of trying to be enough, was gone. I slept for 12 hours straight. When I woke up, I turned my phone back on, just to check. 50 missed calls. Dozens of texts. The tone had shifted now, less anger, more desperation. Dad, Elena, where are you? We need to talk. Mom, please come home, sweetheart. We just want to understand. Sophia, you're being so dramatic. Just call them already. I read through them, letting each one sink in, waiting for that familiar guilt to creep in, but it didn't. I didn't feel anything at all. They wanted to understand? They had years to try. They had years to notice me, to treat me like I mattered. And now that I was gone, now they wanted answers? Too late. I blocked their numbers. I knew they would report the car stolen. I had expected that. But I had a plan for that too. I drove to a small town a few hours away and found a used car dealership. I negotiated a trade-in, something quick and quiet, no unnecessary paperwork. The guy barely asked any questions, he just wanted to make a sale. I left the lot in a different car, paid for in cash, no longer tied to them in any way. And then I drove again. It wasn't running away. It was starting over. I had always imagined my future as something that existed inside their world. I had planned my life around what would make them proud, what would make them see me. But now, I was free to imagine something else entirely. For the first time, my life belonged to me. I found a small city a few states over and decided to stay. It wasn't anything special, just a quiet place where no one knew me, where no one expected anything from me. I found a cheap apartment, nothing fancy but mine, and took a job at a bookstore while I figured out my next steps. The strangest part wasn't the loneliness, it was the absence of the constant, gnawing ache I had grown used to. I wasn't waiting for approval. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just living. Weeks passed, and I felt lighter. I started reading for pleasure again, something I hadn't done in years. I spent afternoons in coffee shops without worrying about who I should be impressing. I walked through the city, nameless and free, and realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt real. One evening, as I sat by my apartment window watching the sunset, I thought about them. About my mother's forced elegance, my father's cold indifference, Sophia's effortless entitlement. I wondered if they were still searching for me, still trying to fix a problem they had created but never acknowledged. I wondered if they finally understood what it felt like to be abandoned. And then, I closed the curtain. I had my own life to focus on now. Months passed, and I built something I never thought I'd have, a life that was truly mine. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't something my parents would have boasted about at their dinner parties. But it was real. The bookstore job was temporary, but I liked it more than I expected. The quiet hum of pages turning, the occasional customer asking for recommendations, the solitude of stocking shelves, it was nothing like the high-pressure, achievement-driven life I had lived before. Here, no one expected me to be perfect. No one measured my worth in trophies or test scores. I was just Elena. And for once, that was enough. I saved what I could and after a few months, found something better, an office job with decent pay and flexible hours. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me stability. With my degree, I could have aimed higher, but I wasn't in a rush anymore. For the first time, I was making decisions based on what I wanted, not what would impress my parents. And it felt good. I never unblocked their numbers. I thought about it once or twice, wondering what they had said in the weeks after I vanished. But deep down, I already knew. My mother would have cried, blaming herself without ever admitting why. My father would have raged, furious that I had taken what he believed belonged to him. And Sophia, well, Sophia would have been annoyed at the inconvenience of losing her family's attention for even a moment. I owed them nothing. One day, I checked my email and saw something unexpected, an alert for a house listing. My childhood home. For sale. I clicked on the link, curiosity getting the best of me. There it was, in perfect high-resolution images, the pristine white pillars, the carefully arranged furniture, the flawless staging. But I knew the truth. That house had never been warm. It had never been home. It had been a glass cage, one that only shattered when I walked away. I imagined my parents packing up, forced to downsize, forced to feel what it was like to lose something important. I imagined them wondering how it had all come to this. Maybe for the first time, they were finally feeling what I had felt my entire life. I closed the listing without a second thought. That night, I sat on my small balcony, drinking tea as the city lights flickered around me. The air smelled different here, not of expensive perfumes or carefully curated perfection, but of fresh possibilities. Of freedom. I didn't know what my future held. I didn't have a grand plan, and for the first time, that didn't scare me. Because whatever came next, it was mine. And I would never look back.